Now, today's talk is part of our lecture series, Conversations in Forest History. Our guest today is Paul Sutter. Paul's an environmental history professor at the University of Colorado. His first book, Driven Wild: How the Fight Against Automobiles Launched the Wilderness Movement, came out 20 years ago this year, and it is the subject of today's talk. He's going to do kind of a retrospective or a revisit of that book. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Paul.
Well, I want to thank Jamie and everyone at the Forest History Society for inviting me to give this talk and for their kindness in recognizing the 20th anniversary of Driven Wild's publication. And I'll show you a look at that now ancient cover. My book, Driven Wild, examines the 1935 founding of the Wilderness Act, of the Wilderness Society, the first national organization dedicated to wilderness advocacy. And such advocacy would culminate in the passage of the Wilderness Act of 1964. Here you see LBJ signing that very act into law. And the creation of a system of designated wilderness areas within all the major public lands designations that now totals almost 110 million acres. The central question of Driven Wild was, where did the modern wilderness idea come from, and why did it arise when it did? More specifically, I was curious why this group of advocates felt like we needed a system of preserved wilderness areas so soon after the creation of the National Park Service in 1916 and the growth of the nation's system of national parks. Before I took on the topic, or just as I was taking on the topic, almost 30 years ago now, the general consensus was that the modern wilderness idea differed from the national park idea in several important ways. One was aesthetic. The national parks were rooted in monumental scenery, and wilderness, the argument went beyond the scenic to celebrate an immersive and unmediated aesthetic of wild nature. Ethically, many also saw wilderness as a more biocentric ideal than the park ideal, a protection of nature for its own sake, for its own values. And from a scientific standpoint, wilderness has seemed to many to protect the complex ecological relationships, and thus seemed to be an ideal rooted in the influence of the young discipline of ecology, which was maturing during the interwar years. So according to this argument, this received wisdom, wilderness advocacy emerged when it did during the 20s and 30s because the science of ecology allowed a certain key environmental activists to rethink preservation aesthetically, ethically, and scientifically. And when I began my research on the founding of the Wilderness Society, I largely accepted this logic and assumed that I'd be telling a detailed version of a missing chapter in a story that historians, environmental historians, already knew. But one of the things about the Wilderness Society and their founders that struck me as anomalous, and this is going to be a focus of my talk today, was that 4 of the 8 founders were foresters. Trained foresters, many of whom worked with the U.S. Forest Service, all of whom worked with the U.S. Forest Service at one point. So why did this seem strange to me? Well, because American environmental thought during the preceding era, the progressive era, had come to be defined by a clash between utilitarian conservation, the wise use of natural resources to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time, a tradition embodied by the new profession of forestry, and a clash between that and aesthetic preservation, the protection of landscapes against all economic uses and for recreational and spiritual enjoyment. No battle did more to solidify that sense of opposition between preservation and conservation than the one over the Hetch Hetchy Valley within Yosemite National Park, a battle precipitated by the city of San Francisco, which was seeking a new municipal water supply after the 1906 earthquake. And this is a picture of Hetch Hetchy, celebrated as the second Yosemite Valley. That battle would eventually pit the champion of Sierra preservation and founder of the Sierra Club, John Muir, against the embodiment of the utilitarian tradition and the nation's first chief of the Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot. And those same battle lines between conservation and preservation also seem to be operative in the years after World War II, when historians first started paying attention to the history of US environmental thought and politics, and when the battle to preserve wilderness again seemed mostly to be at odds with the practices and priorities of resource extraction and the federal conservation agencies, the Bureau of Reclamation, the Forest Service, etc., that were eagerly facilitating it. The idea that foresters then could be at the vanguard of wilderness preservation struck many as nonsensical. Or the assumption was that foresters, when they embraced wilderness advocacy, somehow jettisoned their former commitments to utilitarian conservation. But what I suggested in Driven Wild, and what I want to suggest today, is that in fact the battle lines were drawn quite differently during the interwar years, which helps explain why wilderness preservation emerged as an idea largely birthed by foresters. My foundational epiphany actually came when I read the first issue of the Wilderness Society's magazine, The Living Wilderness. Instead of a group roundly opposed to the excesses of resource extraction and critical of the philosophical limitations of both utilitarian conservation and scenic preservation, national park preservation, I found a group obsessed with road building and the automobile. Every article in that first issue bemoaned those threats. And the article that was on the front page ended with a curious rallying cry that I want to quote briefly here. Quote, 10 years of warfare in Congress have saved the national park system from water power and irrigation, but left the primitive decimated elsewhere. What little of it is left is passing before a popular craze and an administrative fashion. The craze is to build all the highways possible everywhere, while billions may yet be borrowed from the unlucky future. The fashion is to barber and manicure wild America as smartly as the modern girl. Our duty is clear, end quote. So this triggered an important realization, this quote and this first issue. Wilderness had more to do with a set of forces new to American history and the American landscape during the 20th century than to some sort of intellectual epiphany on the part of the founders of the society, rooted in biocentrism and ecology and a new wilderness aesthetic. The founders of the Wilderness Society, I argued, were literally driven wild, pushed to embrace a new preservationist ideal by a set of developments centered on the automobile, aggressive road building, new patterns of outdoor recreation, and government programs that made the nation's public wildlands accessible to motorists. Now, to understand this, let's quickly go back to the mid-1910s and several important developments over the decades leading up to the 1935 founding of the Wilderness Society. Hetch Hetchy in many ways was a Pyrrhic victory for utilitarian conservation, as the battle raised the preservationist consciousness of the nation. And within a couple of years of the 1913 decision to dam that valley, we had the National Park Service, which gave the national parks a much stronger policy voice and a bureaucratic home, a launching pad for growth in many ways. But there was more than simply a shift in national sentiment going on. Preservationist sentiment itself was in the process of being reshaped by automobility. And the mid-1910s were crucial. Not only did we see the formation or the creation of the National Park Service, we see assembly line production of the automobile and ownership rates that would rise dramatically between, say, the mid-teens and the end of the 1920s, by which point something like 1 in 5 Americans had an automobile. The Panama Canal expositions in California, which celebrated the completion of the Panama Canal in the mid-teens, also, and somewhat ironically, triggered a startling rise in the number of transcontinental motor trips, most of which were recreational, and most of which involved visiting national parks and other wildlands along the way. 1916 also saw the passage of the first Federal Aid Highway Act and the beginning of federal funding for an automotive infrastructure, which to this point had been really quite rudimentary. Those transcontinental transcontinental motor trips were quite rough in the mid-teens. And it was also the moment when we saw various See America First promotional efforts, sponsored initially by railroad companies and booster groups, and then by the National Park Service itself. Now, this term, See America First, predated World War I. It was a kind of patriotic call for Americans to see their continent's natural wonders before heading off on a European grand tour. But it gained added resonance with the onset of World War I and the closing of Europe to tourist travel. In short, then, just as Hetch Hetchy was defining this neat ideological dualism between conservation and preservation, the automobile arrived to vastly complicate what preservation meant. And wilderness advocacy would emerge out of that complexity. One of the chief threats posed to de facto wilderness by the rise of automobility was a burgeoning network of roads. This is a somewhat boring story. I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but I do really want to emphasize how quickly roads would penetrate many of the nation's remaining wildlands, which were usually also public lands during this period, and particularly national forests. And this raised a question of fundamental importance to these advocates, one that I'm not going to talk a lot about in the talk, but I'd be happy to discuss later. Did roads give more people access to wilderness areas, or did roads destroy wilderness areas? Now, many preservationists saw automobiles as a democratic technology of access. This was particularly true of Stephen Mather, who headed the National Park Service in its early years and was quick to realize that the automobile and a growing network of roads gave the parks an economic rationale, tourism, that John Muir had lacked in his fight to save Hetch Hetchy just a few years earlier. And both Mather and his successor, Horace Albright, and they're both pictured here in front of U.S. National Park Service Automobile number 1, sort of hitched the Park Service's mission to automobility and the visitation that it would bring. Now, Americans have been using their automobiles to get out into the natural world since the turn of the century, when people first started getting their hands on automobiles. And the first generation of motor tourists usually saw the automobile as a liberating technology that freed them, for instance, from the restrictive schedule of the railroad, from the stuffy formalities of resort hotels. It allowed them to spurn the high-priced and elite tourist infrastructure that existed up to that point and head out into the countryside as if it were nature itself, camping wherever they found themselves at the end of the day, often on land that was privately owned. The historian Warren Belasco has called this the squatter anarchist phase of auto camping, and it was rife with abuses. Farmers felt particularly abused. Automobiles on rural roads would spook horses, and their land was often freely used by auto campers who would take their subsistence from planted crops, help themselves to water from wells, and often leave fences open, allowing livestock to escape. More than that, auto campers were a messy lot. They left litter, and particularly tin cans, all over the place. They polluted land and water with human waste. They chopped down trees for firewood and shelter. And this is, I apologize for the quality of this image, but if you look carefully, you'll notice that they've chopped down a tree and created a little shade between the tent and the automobile. And sometimes they failed to put out their fires as well, creating a fire hazard. As a result, the sort of period of this very open road where auto campers could sort of stop and camp almost anywhere slammed shut quite quickly in the years after World War I. In some cases, to stem these abuses, municipalities, cities, and towns created free municipal auto camps. And I'll show you actually here a picture of what was the municipal auto camp in Boulder, Colorado, where I'm now residing. It's now called Evan Fine Park. These cities and towns were trying to shunt these auto campers into these free camps, but also try to take advantage of some of the tourist spending that they would bring. Though these municipal auto camps would only last so long, in part because town and city leaders realized that not all campers were recreational campers, a problem that became even more fraught during the Great Depression. And one of the results is that these municipal auto camps would often evolve into what we come to know as the the motel. And in fact, one of the very earliest motels in Boulder was right next to this municipal auto camp. By the mid-1920s, you get a cartoon like this, and I hope you can see it reasonably well. And I'll do a quick analysis of it. But you know, the top scene: once the delicious reward of only the venturesome and the resourceful. Here you see a packer getting into an alpine lake, beautiful alpine lake, untouched. Now anyone can have for a few gallons of gasoline and an eye full of dust. And you see the lake positively ringed by fisher people, automobiles zooming through, someone saying nothing to see around here, let's try to make it to the next camp before dark, lots of billboards, lots of trash. And this was 1926, this cartoon, giving a sense of how quickly at least some parts of wild America were being transformed by these forces. One of the upshots of all of this, in fact, was that as these roadside changes occurred, more and more Americans drove their automobiles onto the public lands, onto national parks and into national forests, not only because automobiles allowed people to get to them, but because automobility quickly delimited their other choices. And as they did so, they demanded more and more facilities, and sometimes their behavior prompted more facilities. I like this photo because it basically shows the Yosemite Valley at a point where people would just drive in on a dirt road and then pull off wherever they felt like it and just set up their tents. And that ended up leading to the first modern campground design by a man named Emilio Meineke, who was in fact a plant pathologist concerned about all the damage being done to plants and plant life by this sort of willy-nilly approach to camping. Here you have the sort of garage spur and loop design that so many of us are now familiar with if we've car camped in the national parks or the national forests, right? The Great Depression then would morph this recreational sentiment in some interesting ways, particularly with the rise to power of this man, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose New Deal let loose an army of unemployed workers on the public lands, many of whom were charged with building roads, trails, bridges, campgrounds, and other recreational facilities. The Civilian Conservation Corps alone did a tremendous amount of work to develop national parks, state parks, national forests, much of it for motorized recreational access. And if you remember that initial quote I read to you, these were the people that the Wilderness Society founders were considering the barbers and manicurists of wild America. One of the most important initiatives, indeed, of the New Deal period was a series of recreational highways in the early 1930s, among them Going to the Sun Road in Glacier National Park. This is a photograph of its 1933 opening. The construction of the Skyline Drive in the newly created Shenandoah National Park, and then the Blue Ridge Parkway that went south from it. And I believe this is a photo of Blue Ridge Parkway under construction. And there was even talk of a series of other Skyline roads through other parts of Appalachia during this period, something that I'll return to in a little bit. In fact, it was these Skyline roads that in many ways precipitated the founding of the Wilderness Society, which was unofficially hatched by the side of a road in Tennessee during the 1934 annual meeting of the American Forestry Association, and then officially constituted in January 1935 at a meeting at the Cosmos Club. It was in the context of all of this change then that a number of conservationists, the most important among them foresters, began to argue for wilderness preservation as a way of protecting the nation's remaining wildlands from the transformative impacts of motorized outdoor recreation. This was the central argument of my book. Dam building, timber harvesting, livestock raising, mining, and other extractive uses were not the major concerns of the founders of the Wilderness Society. Recreational motorists and their demands and the incentives they created for wildland development were their biggest concerns. All right, so with about the 10 minutes that I want to keep talking, I want to shift now to talk about just a couple of the founders. The book Driven Wild itself features 4 of the 8 founders, 3 of whom were foresters. And I'd like to briefly talk about 2 of them because I think they provide really interesting examples of how forestry played into wilderness advocacy. The first is likely very well known to most of you, Aldo Leopold. Leopold was the first person to suggest and in fact achieve wilderness preservation. Now, some will argue for a Coloradan named Arthur Carhart. If anyone wants to ask me about that later, I'm happy to talk about that, but I consider Leopold to be the founding figure of wilderness preservation in this country. In the early 1920s, Leopold convinced the Forest Service not only to pursue administrative designation of wilderness areas, but to create a large area in New Mexico's Gila National Forest. Let me tell you a little bit more about Leopold. Leopold graduated with a master's degree in forestry from Yale's relatively new forestry school in 1909. And then he headed to the American Southwest for a position with the U.S. Forest Service, which was only a few years old at this point. And over the next several years, he helped the service to gain administrative control over the region's national forests by building roads and trails and by conducting timber reconnaissance. Now, importantly, for much of the interwar period, there was little market demand for national forest timber. Most timber was still being industrially cut on private lands. And in the absence of the ability of federal foresters to practice silviculture on a large scale, other uses took hold on the national forests. And Leopold himself was quick to realize that the administrative infrastructure that he had helped the U.S. Forest to build in the Southwest was providing access not to timber, but to an increasing number of auto campers who were using national forest lands. And 2 pieces of legislation in the late teens were critical to this. One I've already mentioned, the Federal Aid Highway Acts, the first one in 1916, the second one in 1921. In fact, they gave a disproportionate amount of funding to national forest road building, in part because up to this point, most road building was done at the county or in some cases at the state level. Mostly it was rooted in real estate taxes. But the problem for many Western regions was that so much public land had taken land off the tax rolls. And so to be able to afford to build roads to link communities surrounded by national forest land required federal funding. And so the federal government played a very direct role in building the national forest road system during this period. Secondly, there was a little known piece of legislation called the Term Permit Act of 1915, which allowed what I call recreational homesteading in the national forest. Under the act, citizens could apply for and obtain 30-year term permits or leases to Forest Service land to build vacation cottages and even hotels and resorts. And these permits proliferated quite rapidly. Here's one in the Angeles National Forest the San Bernardino National Forest outside of Los Angeles. By 1924, there were more than 10,000 such recreational permits, many of them on the scenic lake shores within national forest lands. But there were also, even sort of whole-scale cabin communities. This is another one on a national forest outside of Los Angeles. The U.S. Forest Service thus found itself by the early 1920s itching to manage timber, but largely unable to, and reluctantly having to manage recreational users. And it was in this context that Aldo Leopold wrote an article titled "Wilderness and Its Place in Forest Recreational Policy." It was the first public argument for wilderness preservation, and many have read it simply as a call for the recreational preservation of national forest lands at the expense of utilitarian resource development, timber development. And Leopold favored that to a degree, but he had a different distinction in mind. The majority, he wrote, and I'm quoting him here, undoubtedly want all the automobile roads, summer hotels, graded trails, and other modern conveniences that we can give them. But a very substantial majority, I think, want just the opposite, end quote. What they wanted, Leopold argued, was wilderness, or the preservation of landscapes from the sorts of motorized recreational developments that were then transforming the national forests. Listen to how he defined wilderness in that 1921 essay. Quote, "By wilderness, I mean a continuous stretch of country, preserved in its natural state, open to lawful hunting and fishing, big enough to absorb a 2 weeks pack trip, and kept devoid of roads, artificial trails, cottages, and other works of man," end quote. Nowhere here did he call for prohibition of timber cutting or grazing or mining. In fact, in some cases, he saw these activities as potentially compatible. And the point here is not that Leopold wanted wilderness areas to be open to resource extraction. The point is that he defined wilderness in opposition to the main threats that he saw to the nation's wildlands and its public wildlands in particular at this point. And those were recreational developments that catered to motorists. In the 10 years between the creation of the Gila wilderness, largely Leopold's doing in 1924, and the founding of the Wilderness Society, Leopold's attention was largely on other issues. He moved to Wisconsin and devoted his time to game management and the problem of preserving wildness in the agricultural Midwest. He did write a flurry of articles pushing for a national wilderness policy in the mid-1920s, but he was quiet for about a decade after that until the other founders of the Wilderness Society roped him in to be a founding member. Leopold is usually seen as the poster child for what we might call the ecological and ethical transition argument. And it's certainly true that later in his life, Leopold was an eloquent exponent of using ecological insights to forge a new, more humble land ethic that encompassed wilderness as well as many other landscapes. But such insights were by no means what prompted him to seek the preservation of wilderness in the 1920s. And even later in his life, they remained secondary to his critique of automobility and the recreational consumerism that it encouraged. All right, last person. This is someone who many of you maybe haven't heard of, but is equally important to my story. A man named Benton Mackay, M-A-C-K-A-Y-E. You would pronounce it McKay, probably intuitively, but he pronounced it Mackay. Mackay was also trained as a forester, and he devoted his early U.S. Forest Service career to what I call social forestry. During the 1910s, he pointed to what he saw as the crucial weakness in the utilitarian approach to resource development, that it paid almost no attention to labor equity and community sustainability. Mackay pointed out that it was no mistake that some of the era's most violent labor unrest was in the nation's transient lumber and mining camps, places that linked resource extraction and labor strife. And he was one of the few peoples making innovative connections between labor and natural resources during this period. In fact, his most important product from his time in the U.S. Forest Service, so it would also be transferred over to the Labor Department to finish this report, was a report called Employment and Natural Resources, in which he proposed that the federal government undertake the planned colonization of the nation's public wildlands, including national forests, creating socialist communities based in sustainable relationships with natural resources. Mackay's, not surprisingly perhaps, Mackay's plan never saw the light of day, particularly in the wake of World War I and during the Red Scare, when all things socialist were not particularly in vogue. And Mackay would then retreat from government service and take up with a crowd of urban and regional planners that would evolve into the Regional Planning Association of America, of which he was a founder. And then in 1921, just as Aldo Leopold was proposing wilderness preservation in his famous article, Mackay published an article of his own in the Journal of the American Institute of Architects, outlining his most famous idea, a regional plan centered around what he called an Appalachian Trail. The article described a trail the length of the Appalachian Ridgeline, but it called for much more. Mackay envisioned a string of nonprofit, publicly owned recreational resource communities, right out of his earlier report. And the trail itself was to be a recreational hook for a much larger scheme in what he called the regional development of the whole Appalachian region. By 1925, a group of hiking clubs had formed the Appalachian Trail Conference, a confederation to oversee the completion of the trail, which was first completed by 1938, a remarkable achievement in recreational engineering. Mackay, meanwhile, turned to outlining his broader regional planning vision and to countering what he increasingly saw as the major enemy of the Appalachian Trail, the automobile and the metropolitan sprawl that it facilitated. Though Mackay still harbored hopes that resource communities of his earlier plans might be realized in Appalachia, he saw open space preservation as key to shaping a livable modern landscape and controlling sprawl, what he called metropolitanism. In this sense, in many ways, he was way ahead of his time in being concerned about sprawl. Now, not surprisingly, by the 1930s, much of Mackay's attention was taken up in opposing that very series of skyline drives that was being planned for and built along his Appalachian Trail, nearing completion. The Skyline Drive, the Blue Ridge Parkway, a proposed Green Mountain Parkway in Vermont, and even a proposed road that would have run down the ridgeline of the newly created Great Smoky Mountain National Park. To counter such plans, Mackay became adamant that his trail was a wilderness trail. He began using that word quite explicitly, designed to be free from the sights and sounds of the modern world. It was this clash between Mackay's vision of a wilderness trail and the growth of mechanized recreation in Appalachia that prompted him to embrace wilderness as a new preservationist ideal. Indeed, disgusted with the refusal of the Appalachian Trail Conference to oppose the building of these recreational parkways along the Appalachian Trail, Mackay and several other hiking club allies left the Appalachian Trail Conference, and they planned to start their own advocacy group to protect the trail from roads and automobiles. Included here were Harold Anderson of the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club and Harvey Broom out of Knoxville, Tennessee, and a trail club there. But it was this man, another founder of the Wilderness Society and another forester, Bob Marshall, who convinced them that they ought to set their sights on a larger prize, a national organization dedicated to the preservation of wilderness wherever it might be found. Now, in becoming a wilderness advocate, Mackay, like Leopold, like Marshall, never renounced his commitment to forestry and other forms of resource conservation, or even the social commitments that sprang from them. Instead, Mackay's wilderness advocacy was a reaction to the culture of motorized recreation and the threats that it posed to his AT vision, which made him very much of a sort with the other founders of the Wilderness Society. And I'm just going to end it right there since I'm pretty much at my time. And I would love to see if there are any questions or comments from the audience.
Well, thank you, Paul. That I was jotting down notes like crazy. It reminds me that I need to go back and read your book because that was a great overview, but to get the detail and the nuance, that requires a book, and you have written that book. While we're waiting for some questions, you had mentioned there's a little debate about Arthur Carhart versus Aldo Leopold in terms of who we might credit for, was it the concept of wilderness or wilderness areas?
Yes.
Could you touch on that, please?
Sure. So there's a place in Colorado in the White River National Forest called Trappers Lake. And I don't know if any of the folks in the audience today have been to Trappers Lake. I've only been there once or twice. I was actually lucky enough to be part of a U.S. Forest Service celebration of the, I guess it was the 100th anniversary of the protection of Trappers Lake. Arthur Carhart was a trained landscape architect who was hired by, I guess it was then District 2 of the U.S. Forest Service, to effectively bring landscape architecture into the Forest Service to plan for and develop recreational facilities. And Trappers Lake, which to this day is incredibly remote, it still involves a very long and bumpy drive down a gravel road to get to, had become so popular that people from the Front Range were putting in applications in the late teens for term permit developments, for cottages around the lake. And Carhart was asked to basically go out to Trappers Lake and plat these various cottages so that there was some sense of planning to how they were laid out. He got out there, he took one look at this lake, and he said, I don't think we should put any cottages around it. I think we should keep cottages away from it. He said, maybe a quarter mile, half mile back from the lake, and protect the lake's, scenic integrity from such term permit development. Leopold actually heard about this suggestion, which the Forest Service took him up on, and visited Carhart, I believe it was in 1919, to talk about this suggestion. And I have a lengthy discussion about this in the book. I think it was a really important suggestion. I think it also suggests how important that Term Permit Act was to people within the Forest Service thinking about, protecting these lands from development. But it was more akin to protecting the scenic integrity of a relatively small lake from cabin development, rather than, I think that the operative phrase in this context from Leopold's definition of wilderness is an area big enough to absorb a 2-week pack trip, right? And, early on, wilderness designation was usually in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of acres. Later in the process, and I think I saw that my colleague Jay Turner might be right here today, he's written extensively about this. We get wilderness areas, I think, as small as 5,000 acres, if not smaller. But Leopold's concept was a much bigger, broader concept. In some ways, Carhart, while he proposed a solution, was also part of the problem, because he was in other parts of the national forest very vigorously and enthusiastically building recreational developments. And that's not to, diss Arthur Carhart. He was an incredibly important figure in the early history of the Forest Service's recreational policymaking and recreational development, and would also, as some of you may know and many of you may not, be effectively the founding figure in creating the conservation collection at the Denver Public Library, just down the road from me, which is one, along with the Forest History Society, one of the most important conservation archives in this country.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, Carhart was employed by the Forest Service, so he was
right
planning and doing what he was asked to do. But all credit to him for putting the brakes on at Trapper Lake. And I'd forgotten that Leopold and Carhart met and discussed that. So James Rassman asked what happened to the thousands of term permit cottages.
That's an excellent question. And my understanding is that, and maybe there are other people out there that can confirm this. My understanding is that some still exist, that there are still places where you can, and Jamie, you may even know. I'm not sure if the Forest Service is still allowing these kinds of developments, but I think there are still some. I think you were able to renew them for up to 99 years. And so there are still places in the National Forest, as I understand it, where they do exist.
Over in the, I'm not sure if it's in the chat form, but I do know that one of our members has an original cottage, owns an original cottage. So I think it's ongoing.
Yeah.
Now, to your point, or to your question, rhetorical question, whether they're doing new permits or not, I couldn't tell you.
Yeah.
And maybe somebody can chime in on in the Q&A about that. John Schuyler, I think it is, asks, how do you see the formation of administrative wilderness? Those were done under the L regulations by the Forest Service prior to the Wilderness Society, and who were the advocates within the agency for the L regulations?
Right. So there were. That's an excellent question. Thanks, John. I should have gone back and read through the details so I get all this right. I talk about both the L regulations and what were called the U regulations, which came a little bit later and predated the Wilderness Act. But first, a key distinction: the Wilderness Act of 1964 would create statutory wilderness. And one of the things it would do is would fold a whole series of administrative wilderness areas that had been created up to that point into the National Wilderness Preservation System. But I want to say it was only, I don't know, 8 or 9 million acres at that point. And so the story, again, which Jay Turner tells beautifully in The Promise of Wilderness, of how it went from that to 110 million acres, is a story to a great degree of citizen activism and other stories. Now, the L regulations sort of followed Leopold's advocacy. And one of the things that I found in looking at this is that, again, there was a sense that the Forest Service and foresters were not necessarily so into preservation, particularly wilderness preservation. That was a sense that was sort of really confirmed because after World War II, because the Forest Service would in fact be, in many cases, an impediment to wilderness designation. Not always, but I argue in the book that foresters and particularly forest administrators found administrative designation of wilderness as sometimes quite helpful for, in a sense, keeping motorized recreationalists out of large areas and thus limiting the kinds of management that they would have to do in these areas. So administrative regulation was not necessarily permanent. I think a lot of foresters saw it as a temporary land designation that, if the timber ever became valuable or needed, could be undone. Leopold was obviously an early advocate. Bob Marshall would be critical as well. There were a number of other foresters, and most of these were foresters on the ground in the West who were pushing for certain areas. I mean, I forget, this must have fallen under the L regulations, the U regulations. Another one of the founders who I didn't talk about and didn't write about much in the book was Ernest Oberholzer, who was an advocate for what we today know as the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, the Quetico Superior region. And the story up there is very similar, except with motorized boats rather than automobiles. But there were lots of people on the ground who, these are people who were both deeply in love with the profession of forestry and deeply committed to utilitarian conservation, and living in and traversing these wild landscapes, and to a great degree falling in love with them as well. And no figure in the end, to address John's question, was more important to, in a sense, an initial inventory of national forest wilderness than Bob Marshall, who would put together the first map of the nation's remaining large roadless wilderness areas, particularly in the national forests.
Well, I'm going to drop down to George Andre. George, I apologize if I've mispronounced your name, because you're talking about the contemporaries here of Gifford Pinchot and Henry Graves, the first and second chiefs of the U.S. Forest Service. And George says many U.S. foresters and forestry scholars, like Pinchot and Graves, were part of a larger transnational networks part of larger transnational networks with connection.
Yeah.
Were there any transnational dimensions to the creation of the Wilderness Society, given that so many founders were foresters?
This is also a really excellent question, and I've actually written about some of the transnational connections in conservation more broadly in some of my other writings. Interestingly, in the wilderness book, in Driven Wild, I didn't say much about the transnational, and certainly, well, with one important exception, and that is that one of the most important critiques of the wilderness idea has come in the context of its exportation, particularly to the developing world, and that's a whole other can of worms. But I don't remember seeing, at least among this founding generation, too much of a transnational nature. And it could well be that if I were writing the book now, I would look harder. But I think I think part of what explains that is that this was a conversation rooted in a public landscape that was it wasn't unique to the United States, but it was, we were arguing over the remnants of the public domain, much of which had not proven to be amenable to agricultural settlement. And so it was almost by definition a national conversation. Now, there has been lots of conversation about, and scholarship about wilderness as a distinctively American idea, and why are we connected to wilderness in ways that other nations and cultures aren't. My advisor, Donald Worcester, wrote a great essay just even comparing the US and Canada that have very different ideas here. But the quick answer is I do not remember seeing many transnational conversations leading up to the founding. Now, after the founding, and particularly into the post-war years, there was more and more internationalization of the wilderness conversation, culminating today in there are a series of these international wilderness conferences that my Boulder colleague Vance Martin has been critical to helping to organize, along with many other people. And so certainly it would become a transnational conversation, but not so much that I remember seeing during this period.
And some of it's just somebody has to come up with the idea first, and then it attracts the moths to the ideological, or the idea flame, if you will.
Right.
Aspen Brown asks, bear with me. This is a really good question, but it's more complex than I was expecting. He says, in your case studies, wilderness preservation evokes a binary between artificial contextualized, I'm going to guess areas or wilderness, by sprawl or urban landscape, and natural contextualized wilderness. What are the implications in bifurcating mechanical recreation with organic recreation when developing a wilderness ideology?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question that I could answer in a number of ways. So one of the important, to this day, designated wilderness is defined primarily by the quality of roadlessness, and that sort of speaks to my overarching theme. But it's also defined by the absence of mechanization, and that's a critical term. To this day, wilderness managers who have to do trail maintenance in wilderness areas have to bring crosscut saws with them instead of chainsaws. Technically, helicopters are not supposed to be flown into wilderness areas. I mean, this is one of the lines in the sand that separates wilderness designation from other forms of conservation and preservation. In some cases, to the dismay of many who see this as a kind of strange aesthetic choice. I mean, ultimately, what is the difference? But it is a kind of line in the sand. People like Aldo Leopold would talk a lot about, in some ways, to go back to that initial earlier question I asked about, do roads and the automobiles give people access to wilderness, or do they destroy wilderness? For them, they felt like the automobile and roads and the public landscape of automobility was the very manifestation of modernity as it was defined during that period in our history a century ago. And they wanted to protect areas from the sights and sounds of modernity. I mean, Benton Mackay, who was sort of a crusty New England guy, would complain if he heard a radio in the wilderness, right? This sort of thing. And in the current context, I often compare this to, the idea of, say, keeping wilderness areas as areas free from all cell phone or wireless reception or other forms of connectivity, right? I think, that's obviously a different example, but that's the kind of thinking that they were engaged in. And what Leopold then would talk about is, yes, that might mean that many fewer people would use wilderness areas. You would have to work your way in. And it was one of the hardest arguments they had to make, that they weren't elitists. I mean, ironically, one of the great supporters of the Wilderness Society was the sort of the pack trip and dude ranching business that made a lot of money off of sort of packing people into these really remote areas. And usually these people, were people who could afford to pay a lot of money. And so they had to defend themselves against charges of elitism, that the automobile was a democratic technology, that what Aspen calls, this organic mode, was elite. But they really said, no, we want people to work their way in, because that's part of the aesthetic of wilderness, of getting in there on your own. So that's, I think, one way of sort of answering that question. And it was an important part of the debate that they had to constantly defend themselves against. And the other thing I'll say on that is that they weren't, outright opposed to all forms of mechanized outdoor recreation, nor am I. I'm an avid car camper as anyone out there. What they were really saying, though, is we have so many places in our country where people can do this.
Yeah.
And can we not also protect some areas where people can get away from this? And, Bob Marshall wrote a famous piece called Wilderness as Minority Right. And it was this very, interestingly, his father, Lewis Marshall, was a famous civil liberties attorney. And so he was very attuned to these sort of minority rights arguments. And they all hoped that the majority of people would want to recreate in wilderness, but even if they didn't, they argued that we ought to protect at least some of the landscape from these forces of modernity. I hope that answers your question, Aspen.
So that leads me then to Trevor Egerton's question. He says, how did the Wilderness Society founders view Indigenous peoples and their place in these, how do they view Indigenous peoples and their place in these seemingly, quote unquote, non-human wilderness areas? So there's that definition of wilderness and pristine wilderness and all.
Yeah.
So
no, this is a really important question. Trevor's a ringer. He's one of my PhD students, so give him credit for that question. So, one of in the mid-90s, just as I was writing this book, William Cronin, the famous environmental historian, wrote what he will himself call a polemic called the Trouble with Wilderness, and it was part of a much broader critique of the national park and wilderness ideas as effectively dispossessive. Mark Spence wrote a great book called Dispossessing the Wilderness, which is about how the national parks, in their creation, literally remove native peoples from them. And there are all sorts of examples of this. And it's a profoundly important argument, which I have really no dispute with. Interestingly, the Wilderness Society members, well, they were somewhat attuned to this problem.
okay.
Probably the most important figure here is Bob Marshall. Now, Marshall was a trained forester who got his start with the U.S. Forest Service, but by the time that the Wilderness Society was founded, he was actually working as a forester with the Bureau of Indian Affairs under John Collier. And in fact, there were 10 people who were invited to be founding members of the Wilderness Society, and one of the two who declined was John Collier. Now, for those of you who don't know John Collier was a longtime advocate for tribal sovereignty and indigenous cultures. He was the architect of what became known as the Indian New Deal, a reversal of the dispossessive policies of the Dawes Act and other sorts of things. This was by no stretch of the imagination a perfect policy. It often romanticized Native peoples, indigenous peoples in ways that many people find problematic today. But the Wilderness Society founders, I think, were attuned to, at least some of them, and it's probably important to say that, some of them were attuned to the contemporary struggles of indigenous peoples during the reservation period. And I think Marshall envisioned wilderness designation on reservation lands, which was an effort, as a way of protecting indigenous sovereignty on those lands. That when roads and automobiles and the kinds of developments that came with them came onto indigenous lands, they produced forms of development that were often dispossessive. Now, I think that's a somewhat romantic argument, but he was much more attuned to these issues than other conservationists and preservationists were during this period. Interestingly, there's another one of my colleagues, Marcia Weisiger, has written this wonderful book about the Navajo grazing controversy called Dreaming of Sheep in Navajo Country. If you're interested in that story, which is also a 1920s and 30s story for the most part, I would strongly suggest that book. And Marshall emerges in that book as something of a hero, as one of the few people who kind of, within the federal conservation bureaucracy, who understood why stock reduction was such a culturally destructive practice, and really pushed the federal government to engage with and think more deeply about the Diné people and their needs. So it's a good question. That's sort of a hemming and hawing answer, but it's an important issue. And certainly the other thing I'll say about Marshall is that he would in some ways be the genesis of the idea that the environmental historian Ted Catton would call inhabited wilderness, as it gets played out in the Alaskan context after World War II, when the designation of wilderness areas there in fact accommodate indigenous subsistence resource use in ways that they wouldn't accommodate other kinds of use.
Just to let folks know, there's 3 or 4 people have chimed in on the question about the term permits, and it looks like, in short, I'm going to just say that they continued after World War II, but now as they expire, they're not renewing it. They're not actively eliminating them. Okay, but they're not issuing new ones either.
That was my sense, but I wasn't positive, so thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I know one of the people chiming in is with the Forest Service. I don't know the others, but it seems like the consensus. So thank you all for weighing in on that. Muriel Moore asks if you could speak about the impact of cars in municipal campgrounds. She notes that Burlington, Vermont established their municipal campground in the 1920s, and this is remarkable. It's still going strong 100 years later. And that most of these disappeared with the coming of motels, which I know you noted, but I was wondering if you could touch a little bit on the municipal campgrounds.
Yeah, and again, this is one of those things, is because I really was so focused on the period, between World War I and World War II, I didn't really follow through on what became of the fate of these campgrounds, and so I am surprised to hear that there still is a municipal campground that dates from this period, if I'm reading Muriel's question right. Again, most of them, I think, they were effectively commercialized, and again, I think a lot of it had to do with trends, particularly during the Great Depression, but even exclusive of the Great Depression, when people were using these facilities who were effectively not recreational campers, but camping for other reasons. Another book on this that I would highly recommend is my colleague Phoebe Young's new book, Camping Grounds, where it's a history of camping that really looks at all the different ways and reasons for sleeping outside, and argues that recreational forms of camping sort of had to navigate this particular space across the late 19th and 20th century, between functional forms of camping, military camping. A lot of these miners and timber workers lived in camps. The Ludlow massacre in Colorado, those folks were camping. And other forms of camping that resulted from, in some cases, poverty and things like that. And so, there's my city of Boulder has and my nearby city of Denver have fierce debates today about municipal camping of various sorts, largely rooted in homelessness. So in some ways, I'm surprised. I think to a degree, the demise of the municipal campground was a casualty to a great degree of what the mainstream might describe as transgressive camping.
Okay. Peter Thompson is, he says he's a trained Germanist, so I'll give some context here to that. Says he's wondering how much of the story of American conservation should be placed within a broader global history of conservation empire, which that was something I thought of with the displacement issue, empire and resource extraction, specifically thinking of the personal and professional exchanges between foresters in the US and Germany. That included Aldo Leopold. This is 1935, 36, the Oberlander Trust Exchange, where a group of foresters, most from the US Forest Service, went to Germany and observed, and Leopold came back with some really interesting things to say about game management and wilderness.
Not so much wilderness, more about forestry practice.
I know he was struck by the sterility of the German forests. But Peter's asking if you could just kind of put it in the context, and he says, perhaps the American story is quite exceptional, and maybe it does need to be told independently for a number of reasons.
So thanks, Peter. So first of all, it's absolutely true that forestry as a discipline was transnational at birth, right? Gifford Pinchot studied in France with German foresters who cut their teeth in British India. And so, particularly, forest conservation and adjacent resource conservation were transnational and often, occurred in imperial settings. And here, I think, this is complex stuff that many people on here might not be interested in. Peter, maybe you and I can continue a conversation elsewhere. Some of it is a distinction between what we might call colonial societies and settler societies. I think of wilderness as very much a concept, a settler society concept, right? Rooted in a kind of imagining of settlers coming to a place, defining it as wild and vacant, transforming it in ways that they then become nostalgic about, and then protecting remnants of what they had transformed. It's also the case, and I've written some about this as well as the transnational conservation stuff, that the national park idea was transnational at birth, despite the rhetoric embraced by Ken Burns, among others, that the national park idea was America's best idea. It doesn't really hold water. Or to put it another way, obviously the United States was a hugely important nation to the early history of the national park concept, but it was not the only one. And Ian Tyrrell has written about this, among others. So it certainly was the case that conservation, in the broadest sense, was transnational at birth. In fact, it's a book I would love to write at some point. And there are lots of other people that have written about it in very particular contexts. Forestry in particular, soil science and soil conservation, etc. Leopold himself does go to Germany, as you mentioned, Jamie, and as Peter mentioned. I don't recollect a lot of wilderness sort of content in that exchange. So it was really much more about forestry and game management, and the sort of what Leopold came to see as the differences between German forest management, which was much more regimented, and U.S. forest management, and much of that rooted in a kind of just differences in the land base and things like that. I've also written several pieces that sort of put the wilderness idea in the context of first world, third world, or developing world comparison, and particularly around a famous essay that Ramachandra Guha wrote called Radical American Environmentalism, a Third World Critique. But again, I'm not sure I see a ton of influence, except insofar, I mean, maybe one of the things to say about Leopold's trip to Germany is that he came back recognizing how much wilder American forests were than German forests, right? So there is a kind of affirmation of what he saw as an important difference. Yeah. At least at that point. I mean, Europe now has its own rewilding going on that's fascinating in all sorts of ways. But I hope that I'll shoot you a note, Peter. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I think it's kind of he had no point of reference until he went and saw the German forest, and then I was like, wow, we're doing so much better.
I spent 6 months in Munich at the Rachel Carson Society about 5 years ago, and met a German guy there who was doing a Leopold documentary, and very interested in Leopold's German influence, and even participated as a talking head in that a little bit. So I'm not sure if it's seen the light of day yet, but.
And I will say that on our website, we have a digital exhibit about the Oberlander Trust and this exchange of foresters, because it wasn't just this one group that went. There's a longer story there that's quite fascinating. And again, it's foresthistory.org, and then look for digital exhibits and the Oberlander Trust.
Hey, Jamie, I'm just looking at the questions, and there's one that I'd love to answer, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So Bill Rockwell asks, I seem to remember the idea that the Forest Service advocated wilderness in part as an alternative to national park designation within the national forest. So this is also a really important story that I actually had in my presentation, and then I excised for length. But the other argument before I wrote my book about why foresters became avid wilderness advocates was what was known as the rivalry thesis, and that is that in the wake of the Hetchy victory, and then the rise of the National Park Service and preservation and the growth of the national park system, foresters felt on the defensive, and particularly on the defensive because, where is the National Park Service going to find new national parks? Well, on the public lands, often within national forests. I think it was until 1919 that the Grand Canyon was a national forest. It was within a monument within a national forest before it became a national park. So yes, it certainly was the case that certain high-level Forest Service officials were concerned about losing the most scenic parts of the national forests to the National Park Service, and saw recreational development as a way of staving that off. But my research, I think suggested two things about this. One, federal foresters by and large, and particularly those on the ground, were really kind of ambivalent about recreational use of the national forests, in part because managing it had become such a pain in the ass, right? And Carhart was hired as a landscape architect. A guy named Frank Waugh was brought in to do a sort of study of development of national parks. But then the Forest Service largely let landscape architects go, right? They tended to be much more rudimentary in their provisioning for recreationists. They would provide some campgrounds in areas of heavy use, but otherwise would sort of were a little bit more laissez-faire. And they largely saw it as good PR in relationship with local communities and with the public at large. And so I don't think the rivalry thesis quite captures particularly the rank and file sentiment among foresters who weren't avidly proposing recreational preservation. But maybe more importantly, it doesn't quite capture that wilderness was not merely an argument for recreational preservation made against resource use. It was an argument for a certain kind of recreational preservation made against the kind that the National Park Service was most avidly pursuing. And so the book itself sort of teases apart the rivalry thesis, gives it some credence, but also suggests that I don't think it quite captured the complexity of what was going on in terms of forest recreation during this period.
Another argument for getting the book, because of the depth and nuance of so many of these arguments. I want to finish up with, we have a couple of questions regarding wildfire, and I'm going to just roll them together. Yeah. Under Leighton Quarles' question, if you'd mind briefly addressing the Wilderness Society's founders, their ideas regarding the place of fire in these areas, as Leighton says, in the constructed wilderness.
Yeah.
And I'll remind our attendees that four of the 8 founders were foresters. I'm sure Leopold and Marshall at some point found themselves on a fire line. So dealing with wildfire was hugely important to the early Forest Service. Yeah. So with that background, what do you know? Can you address that thought?
I can, to a certain degree. I mean, a quick aside, many people likely know that Aldo Leopold died of a heart attack while fighting a fire in Wisconsin. If you go to the archives at University of Wisconsin, where Leopold's papers are, there's an envelope that says contents of Leopold's pockets when he died. And it's a library card and a driver's license and a few other cards that are all singed around the edges. It's one of those archival moments where you just sort of are dropped right into a place and a time, in this case, a tragedy. One of the arguments within the forestry community that people like Leopold and Marshall in particular would have to engage in were arguments that wilderness would result in timber waste. And sometimes this was in the context of fires, right? If you don't have roads into areas, it's going to be hard to protect those areas from fires. Sometimes it was in the context of just, what foresters would call senescence, that is, old trees dying and falling over. And so I think the critical thing to understand here is, I think people like Leopold and Marshall, Marshall had a PhD in plant pathology. These were smart scientists, right? I'm not sure how I would compare their understanding of the function of wildfire and forested ecosystems to, some of our understandings today. Leopold was probably the most sophisticated thinker on that front. But they, because their early conceptualization of wilderness was largely in contrast to outdoor recreation, fire didn't come into it that much, right? So they weren't, it wasn't really a concern of theirs. And in some senses then that they were happy to say, yeah, one of the consequences of an area that is entirely shut off from mechanized access might be greater fire incidents, right? And difficulty in fighting fires. That was not something that concerned them hugely, because the qualities of wilderness were more important to them. But they also weren't really arguing for wilderness in relationship to the ecological benefits that fire would have in forested ecosystems, right? They were not necessarily what we might call proto-let it burn advocates in their wilderness advocacy. Fire was just not a huge part of their thinking because it wasn't, because those sort of ecological dimensions of wilderness that would really emerge later. Leopold would become head of the Ecological Society of America, and these arguments would certainly emerge after World War II, but it just wasn't as big a part of things back then.
And you also had folks like Ehlers Koch,
yeah,
up in what is now Region 1,
yeah,
arguing after the 1910 fires, as the leadership in the agency was saying, they were moving towards their 10 a.m. policy, put out every fire as quickly as possible. And his argument was, this is, I'm paraphrasing, this is insane. if it's in the backcountry, let it burn. Well, the backcountry is largely what becomes these wilderness areas.
Yeah.
So, there are some who maybe it's not an ecological, it's an economic argument for allowing fire. But the recognition that that's not merchantable or commercial timber. And if it burns, so be it.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned Eller Scotch, because I think that goes back to John Schuyler's question about who some of these early, I would throw him into that category of advocates within the agency, and there were others out there making similar arguments.
Yeah, it's the agency is not monolithic in its approach. There's
not at all.
Lots of dissenters and heretics, especially in the Southeast.
Yeah.
Some who did see the ecological value of fire, but they tried. They may not, like H.H. Chapman at Yale Forestry School was not in the agency.
Yeah.
But was studying the ecological role of fire. Excuse me.
Yeah.
So, thank you to everyone for those great questions. This has been a really enjoyable question and answer session. And Paul, thank you very much for the presentation and spending some time with us. And folks, again, support your local bookshop. Order Driven Wild; it's still available. And really get into this, because it's fascinating and complex, as Paul has certainly made clear. So with that, again, Paul, thank you.